The T-34 versus the Tiger. When Soviet pragmatism met German engineering perfection. Step inside the cramped fighting compartment of a T-34. The air reeks of diesel fuel and gun oil. Your hands grip rough metal controls that judder with every movement. The engine thunders behind a thin firewall, rattling your bones with each revolution. Through narrow vision slits, you glimpse the frozen landscape of the Eastern Front. This is the tank that saved the Soviet Union, they say, the weapon that broke the Wehrmacht. Yet German propaganda called it crude, primitive, unworthy of comparison to their magnificent creations. The Tiger tank, they proclaimed, represented the pinnacle of armored warfare. One Tiger could destroy 10 T-34s, the German crews believed. What happened when these two philosophies collided on the battlefields of Russia would reveal fundamental truths about warfare that extend far beyond tank combat. January 1943, the frozen ruins of Soviet tank crews climbed into their T-34s, preparing for another day of brutal urban combat. They had heard the stories from units that encountered the new German heavy tank. The Tiger I weighed 54 tons, mounted an 88mm gun, derived from the legendary Flak 36 anti-aircraft weapon, and carried frontal armor up to 100mm thick. Its gun could penetrate a T-34 from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. The T-34 weighed only 26 tons, mounted a 76mm gun, and had maximum frontal armor of 45mm. In a direct engagement at long range, the numbers told a grim story for Soviet tankers. German crews, training on Tigers, received extensive instruction on the vehicle's capabilities. They learned that their frontal armor was virtually impervious to T-34 fire at combat ranges. They practiced firing the accurate 88mm gun at targets representing Soviet tanks. Their commanders told them one Tiger was worth an entire company of T-34s. The psychological effect was powerful. German tankers felt invincible. The Tiger's combat debut occurred near Leningrad in August 1942. 4 Tigers from Schwer, Panzer Abteilung 502 attacked Soviet positions. Within minutes, 3 Tigers became stuck in swampy ground. The 4th was immobilized by mechanical failure. Soviet forces destroyed all 4 vehicles. This inauspicious beginning foreshadowed problems that would plague the Tiger. Throughout its operational life, the Tiger was designed in response to encounters with heavily armored Soviet KV-1 tanks and the T-34. German anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate these vehicles. The Wehrmacht demanded a tank that could defeat any Soviet armor at long range while remaining invulnerable to return fire. Henschel's design was selected in May 1942, with production beginning in August 1942 at the Henschel plant in Kassel. On paper, the Tiger achieved every design goal brilliantly. The development process had been rushed. Hitler personally intervened multiple times, demanding accelerated production schedules. Engineers warned that insufficient testing would lead to reliability problems. Their warnings were ignored. The pressure to field a counter to Soviet armor overrode engineering caution. The 88mm KWK-36L56 gun was devastatingly effective. It could penetrate 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters using standard ammunition. Against the T-34's 45mm frontal armor, it was catastrophically overpowered. Tigers routinely destroyed T-34s at ranges where Soviet tanks could not effectively return fire. The gun's accuracy was exceptional. German optics provided superior target acquisition and ranging. The Zeiss TZ-F9B telescopic sight offered 2.5x magnification with clear optics that German manufacturers had perfected over decades. The gunner could identify and engage targets with precision that Soviet optics could not match. A well-positioned Tiger could dominate a battlefield, destroying Soviet tanks with methodical precision. The armor protection was equally impressive. The frontal hull was 100mm thick at near vertical angles. The turret front measured 100mm. Side armor was 80mm. Even the rear armor was 80mm. This comprehensive protection meant Tigers could usually survive hits from T-34 guns at combat ranges. The armor plates were face-hardened, providing additional resistance to penetration. German metallurgy was excellent early in the war, producing armor of consistent quality. Soviet tankers learned to fear the Tiger. Reports from the front described the psychological impact of facing these vehicles. T-34 crews knew their frontal shots would likely bounce off. Tiger armor. While a single Tiger round would penetrate their own protection catastrophically, Soviet commanders developed specific tactics for engaging Tigers. Direct frontal attacks were suicide. Instead, Soviet doctrine emphasized maneuver warfare. T-34s would attempt to flank Tigers, attacking from the sides or rear, where armor was still substantial but penetrable at close range. Coordination between multiple T-34s was essential. While one tank distracted the Tiger, others would maneuver for flank shots. These tactics required courage, discipline, and willingness to accept casualties. The lead tank drawing the Tiger's attention knew it would likely be destroyed, but the Tiger's impressive specifications concealed fatal flaws that would limit its strategic impact. The Mayak HL-230 engine produced 690 horsepower, theoretically adequate for the 54-ton vehicle, but the engine was temperamental and complex. It required careful maintenance, high quality fuel, and experienced mechanics. The HL-230 was a V12 gasoline engine with sophisticated fuel injection and ignition systems. Each component required precision manufacturing and careful adjustment. Eastern Front conditions were brutally hostile to precision machinery. Dust in summer penetrated air filters and scored cylinder walls. Mud in spring and fall contaminated fuel and oil systems. Extreme cold in winter froze lubricants and cracked engine blocks. The HL-230 suffered chronic reliability problems. Cooling system failures were common. The cooling fan drive was mechanically complex and prone to bearing failures. When the cooling fan failed, engines overheated rapidly, warping cylinder heads and damaging pistons. Oil leaks occurred frequently from degraded gaskets and seals. The air filtration system, despite multiple iterations and improvements, struggled with Russian dust. Fine particles entered the engine, causing accelerated wear. Engine fires from fuel and oil leaks plagued Tiger units throughout the war. Fuel lines ran along the hot exhaust manifolds. Any leak resulted in immediate ignition. Crews lived in constant fear of engine fires, knowing that ammunition stored in the fighting compartment could cook off if fires spread. The transmission was a sophisticated 8-speed synchromesh design that was advanced for its time but mechanically complex. The Maybach-Olver transmission featured 8 forward gears and 4 reverse gears, providing excellent versatility. In theory, the transmission allowed precise speed control and optimal power delivery across varied terrain. In practice, the complexity created multiple failure points. The Maybach-Olver transmission required skilled operation and careful maintenance. Inexperienced drivers frequently damaged the transmission through improper shifting. The synchromesh system, while easier to use than crash gearboxes, required gentle operation. Forcing gear changes damaged synchronizer rings. As the war progressed and driver training time decreased, transmission failures increased proportionally. The final drives, while stronger than Panther designs, still suffered reliability issues under the Tiger's extreme weight. Field reports documented numerous final drive failures requiring complete replacement. The final drives transferred power from the transmission to the drive sprockets. Under the Tiger's 54-ton combat weight, particularly in rough terrain or during hard acceleration, the final drive gears experienced extreme stress. Metallurgical analysis of failed final drives revealed stress fractures and gear tooth breakage. German industry struggled to produce final drives with adequate strength. Heat treatment processes were inconsistent. Alloy quality declined as the war progressed and Germany lost access to critical raw materials. The Tiger's fuel consumption was prodigious. The vehicle consumed approximately 500 liters of fuel per 100 kilometers on roads, significantly more in rough terrain or combat conditions. To put this in perspective, a Tiger consumed more fuel idling for 1 hour than a soldier's monthly ration allowance. Combat operations saw consumption rates double or triple baseline figures. Hard acceleration, rough terrain, and combat maneuvering pushed fuel consumption to unsustainable levels. A Tiger's fuel capacity of 540 liters provided a theoretical range of 100 to 140 kilometers on roads, less than 100 kilometers cross-country. These figures assumed optimal conditions, experienced drivers, well-maintained engines, and firm terrain. On combat, actual range was often less than 60 kilometers. Tactical situations required constant repositioning. Engines idled for hours while crews waited in ambush positions. Maneuvering to avoid enemy fire consumed fuel rapidly. German logistics struggled desperately to maintain fuel supplies to forward units. Each Tiger required dedicated fuel trucks just to keep it operational. As the war progressed and Allied bombing destroyed German synthetic fuel production, fuel shortages became catastrophic. By 1944, German fuel production had collapsed. Strategic bombing targeted oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants systematically. The Ploiesti oil fields in Romania, Germany's primary natural oil source, were bombed repeatedly. Synthetic fuel plants using the Fischer-Tropsch process were complex facilities that could not be quickly rebuilt once damaged. Tigers frequently sat immobilized, not from combat damage or mechanical failure, but simply from empty fuel tanks. Units would receive enough fuel to move Tigers a few kilometers, then wait days or weeks for the next fuel delivery. Some Tigers never fired a shot in anger because they could not reach the battlefield. Crews would drain fuel from disabled Tigers to keep one or two vehicles operational. This cannibalization reduced overall unit strength, but was the only way to maintain any combat capability. The weight created operational problems beyond fuel consumption. Tigers were too heavy for most bridges. German engineers had bridge classification systems rating load capacity. Most European bridges were designed for civilian traffic and light military vehicles. The Tiger exceeded weight limits of a substantial percentage of bridges in Europe. Engineers had to check load ratings constantly. Bridge reconnaissance became a critical preliminary operation before any Tiger movement. Many bridges could not support Tigers at all, requiring lengthy detours or time-consuming construction of reinforced crossings. Combat engineers would reinforce bridges with additional support structures, a process requiring hours or days. Railroad transport was complicated. Tigers exceeded the loading gauge of many European railways. The loading gauge defines the maximum height and width of vehicles that can safely pass through tunnels, under bridges, and alongside platforms. Tigers were too wide for standard flat cars on certain rail lines. Special loading procedures were required. Outer road wheels were sometimes removed to reduce width. This process required hours of work before loading and again after unloading. Tigers could not traverse standard railroad cars on certain routes without risking structural damage to bridges and track beds. Some rail bridges had weight limits that prohibited Tiger transport. Units had to plan rail movements carefully, identifying routes that could accommodate the weight and dimensions. The interleaved road wheel suspension provided excellent ride quality and ground pressure distribution but created maintenance nightmares. The overlapping wheel design, technically called Schachtelofweg, used multiple rows of road wheels arranged in an overlapping pattern. This design distributed weight more evenly, reducing ground pressure. The ride quality was superior to conventional suspensions. German tankers appreciated the smooth ride, which improved crew endurance on long movements and enhanced gunnery accuracy on the move. But the overlapping wheel design meant that changing an inner road wheel required removing multiple outer wheels first. This process could take an entire day in field conditions. A single damaged inner wheel could disable a Tiger for 24 hours or more. In winter, mud and snow froze solid between the interleaved wheels. Tigers became completely immobilized until crews spent hours with blowtorches and tools breaking away the ice. The overlapping wheels created cavities where mud and snow accumulated during movement. As temperatures dropped overnight, this material froze solid, locking the suspension. Crews would discover their Tigers immobilized the next morning. Breaking the ice required systematic heating of each road wheel assembly. Blowtorches, gasoline fires, or hot water from the engine were used. The process took hours and consumed fuel needed for operations. Soviet tankers learned to attack at dawn during winter, knowing German Tigers would be frozen in place. Soviet forces specifically scheduled winter offensives to exploit this Tiger vulnerability. The T-34, by contrast, had independently mounted road wheels that never froze together. The Christie suspension used large road wheels mounted independently on vertical coil springs. Mud and snow could not accumulate between wheels because there were no interleaved components. Even in the worst winter conditions, T-34 suspensions remained functional. If ice accumulated on individual wheels, it would break off during movement. This seemingly minor design difference provided enormous operational advantages during Russian winters. The T-34 represented an entirely different design philosophy. Soviet engineers prioritized simplicity, reliability, and mass production over technical sophistication. Every design decision reflected these priorities ruthlessly. The origins of the T-34 are traced back to the BT series of fast tanks developed in the 1930s. Soviet designer Mikhail Koshkin led the design team at Factory 183 in Kharkov. Koshkin's vision was a medium tank that balanced firepower, protection, and mobility while remaining simple enough for mass production and operation by minimally trained crews. The design process emphasized practical effectiveness over theoretical perfection. The Christie suspension used large road wheels and sloped armor. The arrangement provided good mobility while simplifying production. Walter Christie, an American engineer, had developed the suspension system in the 1920s. The U.S. Army showed little interest, but Soviet designers recognized its potential. The suspension could be maintained by minimally trained crews with basic tools. Springs could be replaced in the field. Road wheels were individually mounted, simplifying repair. The entire suspension system required minimal, specialized tools or knowledge. The V2 diesel engine was derived from aircraft diesel designs. It produced 500 horsepower, providing adequate power for the 26-ton tank. Soviet aircraft designers had developed aluminum diesel engines for aviation use. The V2 adapted this technology for tanks. The engine was robust and tolerant of abuse. Aluminum construction reduced weight, while cast iron would have been heavier. The V2's design prioritized durability over precision. Tolerances were loose by German standards, but this created beneficial side effects. The engine could run on diesel fuel, kerosene, or low-grade substitutes when necessary. Soviet tankers reported pouring captured German gasoline mixed with oil into their tanks when diesel was unavailable. The engine would run, smoke heavily, but continue functioning. This fuel flexibility was intentional. Soviet logistics anticipated supply disruptions. Tanks needed to operate on whatever fuel was available. The engine's aluminum construction saved weight while the diesel fuel was less flammable than gasoline, improving crew survivability. Gasoline tanks, like those in German tanks, exploded violently when penetrated. Diesel fuel was less volatile. While diesel fires still occurred, they were less catastrophic than gasoline fires. Soviet tankers had marginally better survival odds when their tanks were penetrated. Cold starting in Russian winters was difficult for diesel engines. Diesel fuel gelled at low temperatures. Engine oil became thick as molasses. But Soviet tankers developed effective techniques through practical experience. Soviet crews would light small fires under the engine to warm the oil. They would drain the oil while hot each evening, warm it overnight near a fire, and pour it back warm in the morning. These crude but effective methods kept T-34s running in conditions that immobilized German vehicles. German tankers, trained to follow technical manuals precisely, struggled to adapt. Soviet tankers, accustomed to improvisation, developed field-expedient solutions to every problem. Another technique involved heating coolant water over fires, then pouring hot water into the cooling system before starting. Some crews even heated individual cylinders with torches before attempting to start the engine. The transmission was simple and durable, though difficult to shift smoothly. The T-34 used a 4-speed crash gearbox without synchromesh. Shifting required double clutching and careful timing. Inexperienced drivers ground gears constantly, but Soviet drivers learned to crash the gears forcefully. The transmission could withstand this abuse far better than German precision gearboxes. Soviet metallurgy prioritized toughness over refinement. Gears were cut with wider teeth and greater clearances. This reduced mechanical efficiency slightly, but increased durability dramatically. Maintenance was minimal. The clutch and transmission rarely failed catastrophically. When failures did occur, replacement transmissions could be installed quickly with basic tools. The 76mm F-34 gun was adequate for most battlefield tasks. It could defeat most German tanks, except Tigers and Panthers at typical combat ranges under 1,000 meters. Against Panzer III and IV tanks, the F-34 was effective. Against lighter German armor and vehicles, it was more than adequate. The gun fired an effective high-explosive round for engaging infantry and fortifications. Soviet tanks fought infantry and fortifications more often than they fought other tanks. The F-34's high-explosive shell contained substantial bursting charge, producing excellent fragmentation effects. This made the T-34 valuable in the infantry support role that dominated actual tank operations. Soviet doctrine emphasized close-range engagement, where the T-34's maneuverability and numbers could offset German advantages in gun performance and armor. Soviet commanders understood they could not win long-range gunnery duels against German tanks. Instead, doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuver to close range rapidly. At ranges under 500 meters, T-34 guns could penetrate most German armor. Soviet tactics prioritized positioning over firepower. Flanking maneuvers, night attacks, and use of terrain to close range became standard practice. This doctrine played to Soviet strengths while minimizing German advantages. The armor arrangement was revolutionary. The sloped glacis plate was 45 mm thick at 60 degrees from vertical, providing effective protection equivalent to much thicker vertical armor. When a projectile strikes sloped armor, it must penetrate a greater thickness of material. A 45 mm plate at 60 degrees presents approximately 90 mm of effective thickness to a perpendicular hit. Additionally, sloped armor increases the chance of deflection. Projectiles striking at extreme angles tend to ricochet rather than penetrate. This design influenced tank development globally. American and German engineers studied captured T-34s extensively, noting the effectiveness of the sloped armor scheme. German evaluation reports from 1941 expressed shock at T-34 capabilities. Wehrmacht units encountering T-34s for the first time reported that their standard anti-tank guns were ineffective. The 37 mm PaK 36 anti-tank gun, backbone of German anti-tank defense, could not penetrate T-34 armor reliably even at point-blank range. German infantry watched helplessly as T-34s overran positions, immune to their weapons. This tactical shock prompted urgent German tank development programs. The Panther and Tiger were direct responses to the T-34 threat. German engineers specifically studied the T-34's sloped armor when designing the Panther. The sloped armor was not just effective protection, but also simplified production. Sloped flat plates were easier to manufacture than complex curved armor. Soviet factories could produce T-34 hulls rapidly using relatively simple industrial equipment. Armor plates were cut to size, then welded together. No complex forming or heat treatment was required. The cast turret was crude by German standards, but effective and quick to manufacture. Soviet foundries could pour cast turrets using sand casting techniques that required minimal precision. Surface finish was rough, but this did not affect protective value. Production efficiency was central to Soviet tank design philosophy. The T-34 was designed for manufacture by workers with minimal training in factories with basic equipment. Soviet industrial planning anticipated using workers with limited skills. Women, teenagers, and peasants from collective farms staffed weapons factories. The T-34 had to be producible by these workers using equipment that might be damaged, worn, or improvised. Components were standardized and simplified. A minimal number of unique parts reduced complexity. Parts that could serve multiple functions were preferred over specialized components. Tolerances were loose. German engineers specified tight tolerances, ensuring precise fit and smooth operation. Soviet engineers specified loose tolerances, ensuring parts would fit even if slightly mis. This difference reflected different priorities. German designers wanted optimal performance. Soviet designers wanted guaranteed assembly. Finish quality was rough. Surfaces were not polished. Machining marks were visible. Paint was applied hastily. German engineers examining captured T-34s were appalled by the crude workmanship. Welds were uneven. Machining was rough. Castings had visible flaws, pits, and imperfections. German quality standards would have rejected these tanks as unacceptable, but none of these aesthetic deficiencies affected combat effectiveness. The tank ran, fought, and survived. Soviet production methods prioritized quantity over quality. Factory 183 in Kharkov produced T-34s at astonishing rates. Production lines operated continuously. Workers worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. Productivity increased steadily as workers gained experience and as production methods were refined. When German forces approached Kharkov in 1941, the entire factory was evacuated eastward. This massive industrial evacuation was one of World War II's most impressive logistical achievements. Machinery was loaded onto trains piece by piece. Workers and their families traveled to Nizhny Tagil in the Ural Mountains, over 1,500 kilometers eastward. Within weeks, production resumed. Factory buildings were constructed rapidly, using local materials. Machinery was installed and calibrated. Workers, exhausted from the evacuation journey, began producing tanks again. By 1942, the relocated factory was producing T-34s faster than before. The combination of experienced workers, refined production techniques, and determination to defeat the German invasion drove productivity to unprecedented levels. Workers understood that every tank they produced could save Soviet lives and help drive the Germans back. This motivation translated into extraordinary production achievements. Total T-34 production from 1940 to 1945 reached approximately 84,000 vehicles, including both 76mm and 85mm gun variants. This staggering total dwarfed all German tank production combined. To put this in perspective, Germany produced approximately 24,000 tanks total during the entire war. Soviet T-34 production alone exceeded total German tank production by 3.5 to 1. When Soviet heavy tanks, light tanks, and self-propelled guns are included, the disparity becomes even more overwhelming. Soviet industrial capacity, once fully mobilized and relocated beyond German reach, became an unstoppable production machine. Tiger production totaled only 1,347 vehicles from August 1942 to August 1944. The Henschel plant in Coast, primary Tiger production facility, was a precision manufacturing facility designed for quality over quantity. Each Tiger required approximately 300,000 man-hours to produce. Skilled workers hand-fitted components, adjusted assemblies, and carefully tested each vehicle. This artisanal approach produced high-quality vehicles, but at glacially slow production rates. Peak monthly production reached only 104 vehicles in April 1944. Most months saw production of 50 to 80 Tigers. The disparity reveals the fundamental difference in approach. Germany built technically superior vehicles in small numbers. The Soviet Union built adequate vehicles in overwhelming numbers. The strategic implications were profound. German military planning assumed qualitative superiority could offset quantitative inferiority. One superior German tank crewed by superior German tankers could defeat multiple inferior Soviet tanks crewed by inferior Soviet tankers. This assumption proved fatally flawed. While individual German tanks often achieved impressive kill ratios, the cumulative effect of Soviet numerical superiority was overwhelming. A single Tiger could destroy multiple T-34s in direct combat, but Soviet forces could afford the losses. Soviet commanders planned operations assuming heavy tank losses. Replacement tanks arrived continuously from factories. Tank armies that lost 50% of their strength in one battle would be rebuilt to full strength within weeks. German forces could not afford to lose Tigers. Each Tiger lost represented a significant percentage of total operational strength. If a Tiger unit began with 45 Tigers and lost 15 in combat, that represented 33% of unit strength gone. Replacements might arrive in ones and twos over subsequent months, never enough to restore full strength. Each T-34 lost was immediately replaceable. Soviet tank units expected heavy losses and planned accordingly. Replacement tanks and crews flowed continuously from factories and training centers. Losses in individual battles were irrelevant as long as operational objectives were achieved and losses could be replaced. German units carefully conserved their Tigers, but losses were inevitable in sustained combat. Replacements arrived slowly or not at all. By late 1944, some Tiger units were operating at 20 to 30% strength with no hope of replacement vehicles. Crew training differences amplified the operational disparity. Soviet tank crews received basic training focusing on essential combat skills. Training duration was measured in weeks, not months. The typical Soviet tank crew training program lasted 6 to 10 weeks. Crews learned to drive in a straight line, fire the main gun at stationary targets, perform basic maintenance, and operate in formation. Advanced tactical skills were learned in combat. This approach produced barely adequate crews rapidly. Quality was inconsistent. Some crews became highly skilled through combat experience. Others died in their first battle before learning anything. German Tiger crews received extensive training lasting many months. The typical Tiger training program lasted 4 to 6 months. They learned every system thoroughly. Training covered engine maintenance, transmission operation, gun maintenance, optics adjustment, tactical employment, and combined arms coordination. They practiced gunnery until accuracy was exceptional. Tiger gunners trained to hit targets at maximum range consistently. They studied tactics and doctrine comprehensively. The training produced highly skilled crews who could exploit the Tiger's capabilities fully. Early war Tiger crews were exceptionally skilled, but training capacity was limited. Germany could not produce skilled Tiger crews as fast as Tigers were being lost. As losses mounted, training time was compressed. 6-month programs became 3-month programs, then 2 months. Eventually, replacement crews received minimal training before being sent to combat units. Crew quality declined precipitously. By 1944, many Tiger crews had inadequate training. They could not maintain their vehicles properly. They lacked tactical skills. They made mistakes under pressure. The advantage in crew skill that had characterized early Tiger operations largely disappeared. Late war Tiger units often had 1 or 2 veteran crews and multiple inexperienced replacement crews. Operational availability was the Tiger's greatest weakness. Units rarely had all their Tigers operational simultaneously. Mechanical failures, lack of spare parts, and maintenance requirements kept significant percentages in repair status continuously. A typical Tiger unit might have 70% operational readiness on a good day. Often, readiness dropped to 50% or below. This meant that a unit with 45 Tigers on paper might have only 25 to 30 actually capable of fighting. The others sat immobilized awaiting parts, undergoing repairs, or broken down. Soviet records from the Battle of Kursk in July 1943 documented that Schwer Panzer Abteilung 503 began the offensive with 45 Tigers. This unit had been specially reinforced for the operation. The Tigers were as well maintained as possible given German logistical constraints. Crews were experienced. After 1 week of combat, only 10 remained operational. The other 35 Tigers had been destroyed by enemy action, broken down mechanically, or were awaiting repair. This 78% loss rate in 1 week was unsustainable. A similar pattern appeared in every Tiger unit throughout the war. Operational readiness rates of 50 to 60% were typical. Rates below 50% were common late in the war. Some Tiger units reported operational readiness rates of 20 to 30% in 1945. This meant 4 out of 5 Tigers were known operational at any given time. The T-34's operational availability remained consistently high. Soviet units regularly maintained 80 to 90% operational readiness. Mechanical reliability was good. The simple, robust design meant fewer failures. Maintenance was simple enough for crew-level repairs. Crews could perform most repairs themselves without specialized tools or facilities. Spare parts were widely available. Soviet logistics prioritized spare parts delivery. Standard spare parts packages accompanied every unit. Additional parts were available from forward supply depots. Damaged tanks were recovered and repaired rapidly. Soviet recovery vehicles, often T-34 chassis converted to recovery configuration, accompanied tank units. Damaged tanks could be towed to field workshops within hours. Repairs began immediately. Many damaged T-34s were repaired and returned to service within days. Soviet armored units could sustain high operational readiness rates, even under intensive combat conditions. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 tested both tank designs under maximum stress. German forces launched Operation Citadel, Hitler's last major offensive on the Eastern Front. The operation aimed to eliminate the Kursk salient, a bulge in Soviet lines, by attacking from north and south simultaneously. German forces assembled approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including substantial numbers of Tigers and the new Panther. This was the greatest concentration of German armor ever assembled. Soviet intelligence detected German preparations months in advance. Soviet commanders decided to defend in depth, absorbing the German attack, then counterattacking once German forces were exhausted. Soviet forces deployed approximately 5,000 tanks, predominantly T-34s with 76mm guns. Soviet defensive positions were elaborate. Multiple defensive lines extended 40 to 50 kilometers deep. Anti-tank guns, minefields, infantry positions, and artillery created killing zones designed to bleed. German armor. The battle began on July 5, 1943. The Germans achieved tactical successes, destroying Soviet tanks at favorable exchange rates in many engagements. Tigers and Panthers dominated long-range battles. German gunnery was superior. German tactics were sophisticated, but Soviet forces absorbed the losses and counterattacked relentlessly. For every defensive line the Germans penetrated, another waited behind. Soviet reserves moved forward continuously, feeding fresh units into battle. German armored strength declined steadily. Tigers broke down from mechanical stress. The sustained combat operations stressed engines, transmissions, and final drives beyond their limits. But Panthers suffered catastrophic failures. The Panthers' rushed development showed. Final drives failed. Engines caught fire. Transmissions jammed. Many Panthers were abandoned after traveling only a few kilometers. By the end of the battle, German forces had suffered unsustainable losses in men and equipment. The offensive failed. Soviet forces retained strategic initiative for the remainder of the war. The battle demonstrated that technical superiority could not overcome numerical inferiority and logistical constraints. It also demonstrated that Soviet tactics and operational art had matured significantly since the disasters of 1941 and 1942. The T-34-85 appeared in early 1944, addressing the T-34's main weakness. Soviet designers recognized that the 76mm gun was inadequate against German heavy armor. Tank battles at Kursk had demonstrated this conclusively. The new model mounted an 85mm gun derived from anti-aircraft weapons. The 85mm gun could penetrate 100mm of armor at 1,000 meters, significantly improving anti-armor capability. The gun could engage Tigers and Panthers more effectively than the 76mm weapon, while still not equal to German heavy tank guns. The 85mm narrowed the gap considerably. The turret was enlarged to accommodate 3 crew members, separating the commander and gunner functions. Original T-34 turrets had 2 crew members. The commander also served as gunner, forcing him to divide attention between commanding the tank and engaging targets. This reduced combat effectiveness. The T-34-85's 3-man turret allowed the commander to focus on situational awareness and tactical decision-making, while the gunner focused on target engagement. This improved combat effectiveness significantly. The T-34-85 remained mechanically similar to earlier T-34s, preserving the reliability and production advantages while improving combat capability. Production transitioned rapidly. Soviet industry demonstrated remarkable flexibility. Factory tooling was modified to produce the enlarged turret. Gun production lines were established. By mid-1944, most T-34 production was the 85mm variant. The older 76mm version remained in service, but new production focused on the improved model. The transition took only months, showing Soviet industrial efficiency. By contrast, German industry struggled to modify existing designs or introduce new ones. The T-3-285 proved highly effective in combat. While still inferior to Tigers in direct engagement, the gap narrowed considerably. Soviet tankers gained confidence. They no longer felt helplessly outgunned against German heavy armor. Tactical doctrine emphasized combined arms operations where T-34s supported infantry and artillery rather than fighting enemy tanks alone. Soviet commanders learned to use artillery, anti-tank guns, and infantry to suppress and destroy German armor, while T-34s exploited breakthroughs and pursued retreating forces. This combined arms approach maximized T-3 for strengths while minimizing its weaknesses. German responses to increasing Soviet armor capability produced vehicles of escalating complexity and cost. The Tiger II, or King Tiger, appeared in 1944, weighing 68 tons and mounting a longer 88mm gun. The KWK-43 L71 gun could penetrate 180mm of armor at 1,000 meters. The frontal armor was 150mm thick on the turret and 100mm sloped at 50 degrees on the hull. The King Tiger was virtually impenetrable from the front and could destroy any Allied tank at extreme ranges. On paper, it was the ultimate tank. Only 489 were produced before war's end. The vehicle suffered even worse reliability and mobility problems than the Tiger I. The King Tiger's weight completely overwhelmed its drivetrain. Final drives failed constantly. The Maybach HL230 engine, adequate for the 5014 Tiger I, was desperately underpowered for the 6018 King Tiger. Operational availability was abysmal. Units with King Tigers rarely had more than 30 to 40% operational at any time. Many King Tigers were abandoned after traveling only short distances from factories due to mechanical failures. Fuel consumption was catastrophic. The King Tiger consumed fuel at rates that German logistics could not possibly sustain. The Jag Tiger tank destroyer weighed over 70 tons. It mounted a massive 128mm gun capable of destroying any tank in existence. Fewer than 80 were completed. Most saw minimal combat due to mechanical unreliability and fuel shortages. The Jag Tiger was so heavy it could barely move. Bridges collapsed under its weight. Engines failed constantly. It became a self-propelled pillbox, immobile and vulnerable. German tank development spiraled into increasingly impractical designs, optimized for specific combat parameters while ignoring operational realities. Soviet development, by contrast, remained focused on practical effectiveness. The T-34-85 represented evolutionary improvement of a proven design. No radical changes were introduced. The basic hull, engine, transmission, and suspension remained unchanged. Only the turret and gun were upgraded. This approach minimized production disruption and preserved reliability. Development of the IS-2 heavy tank provided capability against German heavy armor without abandoning the principles of reliability and producibility. The IS-2 weighed 46 tons, mounted a 122mm gun, and featured heavy armor, but it used a proven engine and simple mechanical systems. Soviet designers never forgot the lesson that tanks must actually reach the battlefield and operate there. Logistics determined the war's outcome more than any technical factor. Soviet industry, evacuated from western regions, reorganized in the Urals and Siberia. Over 1,500 factories were relocated eastward in 1941 and 1942. Entire production facilities were disassembled, loaded onto trains, moved thousands of kilometers, and reassembled. Workers and their families traveled with the factories. Upon arrival, factories began producing within weeks. Despite harsh conditions, factories operated continuously. Women and teenagers replaced men sent to the front. Productivity increased year by year despite German attempts to disrupt it. American Lend-Lease aid provided trucks, locomotives, food, and raw materials that freed Soviet resources for weapons production. The United States sent 427,000 trucks to the Soviet Union. These trucks motorized Soviet logistics, enabling rapid movement of supplies and troops. American locomotives and rolling stock replaced Soviet rail equipment destroyed in fighting. American food shipments fed Soviet workers and soldiers. American raw materials, particularly high-grade aluminum, steel alloys, and aviation fuel, supplemented Soviet industrial capacity. This aid was crucial. Soviet industry could focus entirely on weapons production, while America supplied logistical support. Soviet logistics could sustain massive armored operations continuously. Tank armies operated with confidence, knowing fuel, ammunition, and spare parts would arrive. Replacement tanks flowed forward steadily. The logistics system worked because it was planned, resourced, and executed systematically. German logistics collapsed progressively. Allied bombing destroyed oil refineries, disrupting fuel production. The bombing campaign against German synthetic fuel plants was devastatingly effective. By late 1944, German fuel production had fallen to a fraction of 1943 levels. Transportation networks were systematically demolished. Rail yards, bridges, and marshalling centers were bombed repeatedly. Moving supplies became increasingly difficult. Road transport consumed fuel that was desperately needed elsewhere. Raw material shortages forced compromises in production quality. Germany lost access to high-grade ores and alloys as Allied forces captured territory and destroyed supply routes. The disparity in industrial capacity became overwhelming. Germany produced approximately 24,000 tanks and assault guns from 1942 to 1945. This included all types, light, medium, and heavy tanks, plus assault guns and tank destroyers. The Soviet Union produced approximately 5,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in the same period. This 4.4 to 1 numerical advantage was insurmountable. American production added another 88,000 tanks, though most fought in other theaters. Even accounting for the Western Front, Soviet numerical superiority on the Eastern Front was crushing. German forces faced an endless tide of Soviet armor that could not be stopped. German tanker accounts revealed growing awareness of inevitable defeat. Early in the war, Tiger crews felt confident. Their vehicles could dominate any engagement. Soviet tanks seemed numerous but ineffective. Victory seemed inevitable. Memoirs from 1941 and 1942 are filled with confidence. German tankers believed in their technical superiority, their training, and their cause. By 1944, the tone changed dramatically. Memoirs describe constant mechanical problems, Tigers breaking down before reaching battle, lack of fuel immobilized vehicles, units waiting days for fuel deliveries that never came, spare parts never arrived, radio calls requesting critical components went unanswered, logistics officers had no parts to send, production could not keep pace with demand. Tigers sat immobilized awaiting parts that were still on factory assembly lines or lost in transit. Replacement crews were poorly trained. Veterans watched green crews make fatal mistakes. Officers requested more training time, but were told no time existed. The replacement crew system was breaking down under the strain of unsustainable losses. Overwhelming Soviet numbers made survival unlikely regardless of technical superiority. Otto K., one of Germany's most successful tank commanders, described operations in his Tiger in the book, Tigers in the Mud. His accounts reveal both the Tiger's combat effectiveness and its operational limitations. Carriers destroyed over 150 enemy tanks during his combat career, making him one of the highest-scoring tank aces. His tactical skill was exceptional. His courage was unquestioned. Yet his memoirs describe frustration with mechanical reliability. He describes Tigers breaking down at critical moments. He describes the exhaustion of fighting a losing war against endless Soviet tank waves. No matter how many Soviet tanks he destroyed, more appeared. The eastern horizon seemed to produce infinite T-34s. Carriers described one engagement where his Tiger destroyed 17 Soviet tanks in a single battle. The tactical victory was complete, but the strategic situation remained hopeless. Within days, Soviet forces attacked again with fresh tanks. The destroyed Soviet tanks had been replaced. The German Tigers that survived were worn out, low on ammunition, and desperately short of fuel. This pattern repeated endlessly. Tactical victories achieved nothing strategically, because Soviet losses could be replaced, while German losses could not. Soviet tanker Dmitry Lavrenenko became the top Soviet tank ace, credited with destroying 52 German tanks. Before his death in December 1941, he fought in a T-34 and praised its mobility and reliability. Lavrenenko's tactics emphasized maneuver and close-range engagement, where the T-34's advantages offset German technical superiority. He studied German tactics carefully. He noticed that German tanks relied on long-range gunnery. He developed techniques for closing range rapidly, using terrain and suppressive fire. Once at close range, his T-34's gun was adequate, and its mobility superior. His success demonstrated that proper tactics could overcome equipment disadvantages. Lavrenenko trained his crew extensively. They practiced rapid-fire drills until they could fire, reload, and fire again in minimal time. They practiced maneuver drills until movement under fire was instinctive. This training compensated for technical inferiority. Other Soviet tank aces achieved similar results, using similar methods. The common factor was not superior equipment, but effective tactical employment, combined with reliable vehicles that could execute aggressive maneuvers. Soviet doctrine evolved throughout the war. Early battles revealed deficiencies in tactics and organization. The disasters of 1941 were partly due to poor tactics. Soviet tanks were committed piecemeal, without infantry support, against prepared German positions. Losses were catastrophic. Soviet forces learned from defeats. Tank armies were reorganized. Combined arms coordination improved. By 1944, combined arms coordination improved dramatically. Artillery, infantry, and armor worked together effectively. Tank units operated with clear objectives and adequate support. Soviet operational art matured into a sophisticated system. The concept of deep operations developed by Soviet theorists in the 1930s was finally implemented effectively. Deep operations doctrine emphasized breakthrough operations, penetrating deeply into enemy rear areas, disrupting logistics and command structures. Tank armies were the primary instruments for deep operations. They would exploit breakthroughs created by infantry and artillery, then drive deep into German rear areas. This operational approach maximized the T-34's mobility. while minimizing the importance of its inferior gun and armor. Deep penetrations disrupted German logistics, stranding Tiger units without fuel or supplies. The Tiger's mechanical complexity required extensive maintenance infrastructure. Each Tiger unit required specialized recovery vehicles, workshop trucks, spare parts, inventories, and trained mechanics. The Tiger recovery vehicle was a Tiger chassis converted for recovery operations. These were rare and precious. Most Tiger units had 1 or 2 Tigers at most. Standard recovery vehicles could not tow 54-ton Tigers effectively. Workshop trucks carried specialized tools, diagnostic equipment, and spares. These support assets were vulnerable to attack and difficult to move. As German forces retreated, Soviet T-34 units required minimal support infrastructure. Basic tools, spare parts, and crew-level mechanical knowledge sufficed for most repairs. T-34 units carried spare parts on supply trucks that followed the tanks. Crews could replace tracks, road wheels, and engines in field conditions with basic tools. This simplicity enabled rapid operational tempo. T-34 units could advance quickly without waiting for elaborate support columns to catch up. The strategic mobility advantage was enormous. Soviet tank armies could advance 50 to 100 kilometers in a day. German Tiger units, dependent on elaborate logistics, moved at a fraction of that pace. The Tigers weight-limited strategic mobility severely. Moving Tigers by rail required planning and time. Loading Tigers onto rail cars took hours. Rail routes had to be surveyed for bridge weight limits and loading gauge clearances. Rail movement was slow and vulnerable to air attack. Allied aircraft targeted rail lines constantly. Tigers in transit were sitting targets. Road movement consumed enormous fuel quantities and imposed mechanical wear. A 100-kilometer road march consumed 500 liters of fuel and stressed the drivetrain significantly. Tigers could not respond quickly to operational crises. They were committed to sectors where their deployment had been planned carefully. T-34s moved easily by rail or road. Standard rail cars could transport T-34s without special preparations. Road marches consumed reasonable fuel quantities. Entire tank armies could redeploy rapidly. Soviet forces developed deception operations where dummy tank concentrations fixed German attention while real forces redeployed to strike elsewhere. Wooden dummy tanks were constructed in assembly areas. Radio traffic simulated tank unit activity. German reconnaissance detected these dummy concentrations and reported major Soviet forces. German commanders committed reserves to defend against the apparent threat. Meanwhile, real Soviet tank armies moved under radio silence to strike elsewhere. The Battle of Berlin in April 1945 saw massive Soviet armored assaults against desperate German defenders. The final offensive to capture Germany's capital involved over 2 million Soviet soldiers and thousands of tanks. Multiple Soviet fronts converged on Berlin from different directions. German defenders fought with desperate courage, but were hopelessly outnumbered. Some Tigers remained operational in the defense. They fought skillfully, destroying numerous Soviet tanks. Individual Tiger crews achieved impressive kill counts in their final battles, but the outcome was never in doubt. Soviet forces had overwhelming superiority in numbers and logistics. For every Tiger, there were dozens of Soviet tanks. German defenders ran out of ammunition, fuel, and hope. Artillery bombardments of unprecedented intensity shattered German positions. Soviet infantry, supported by T-34s, advanced systematically through the city. The last Tigers fought until immobilized or destroyed, then were abandoned. Crews who survived surrendered. Some Tigers were scuttled by their crews to prevent capture. The war ended with Soviet T-34s parading through Berlin while Tigers rusted in ditches throughout Eastern Europe. German tankers knew their logistics were collapsing. They fought on in their Tigers until fuel ran out or ammunition was expended. Many German tankers were teenagers by 1944 and 1945. The experienced veterans were dead or severely wounded. Boys with minimal training climbed into Tigers knowing they would probably die. Some Tigers were destroyed with crews inside, the hatches jammed shut by penetrating rounds. Others were abandoned in panic as crews fled approaching Soviet forces. The waste of human life and potential staggers the imagination. Young men on both sides died for causes they barely understood, operating weapons they barely mastered, in a war that should never have been fought. The Tiger versus T-34 debate, like the Sherman versus Panther debate, ended not with technical arguments but with results. Soviet T-34s rolled into Berlin in May 1945. The red flag flew over the Reichstag. Tigers lay abandoned throughout Eastern Europe, mute testimony to the limits of technical excellence without systemic support. Some Tigers were recovered and displayed as trophies. Most were scrapped for steel. A few survive in museums today as reminders of German engineering, ambition and failure. The verdict of history is clear and unambiguous. The T-34 was the better tank, not because it had superior specifications, but because it could be produced in quantities that mattered, maintained with resources available, operated by crews that could be trained rapidly, and sustained by logistics that actually functioned. Technical specifications matter only when the weapon can reach the battlefield, fight effectively, and be sustained through extended operations. The T-34 achieved this consistently throughout the war. The Tiger did not. This was not bad luck or coincidence. This was the inevitable result of different design philosophies and strategic approaches. The lesson remains relevant today and always will be. Modern militaries still face the same fundamental choices. Should we build small numbers of exquisite systems optimized for technical performance, or large numbers of adequate systems optimized for reliability and sustainability? This debate continues in modern weapons procurement. Effectiveness in conflict is measured by results, not specifications. A weapon that cannot be sustained in combat provides zero combat power, regardless of its theoretical capabilities. Systems defeat weapons. Sustainability defeats sophistication. Reality defeats theory. The Soviet Union understood this truth from bitter experience. The disasters of 1941 taught Soviet leaders that technical inferiority could be overcome by numerical superiority, operational depth, and industrial mobilization. Stalin's industrialization programs of the 1930s, brutal though they were, created the industrial base that could produce 84,000 tanks. The evacuation of factories eastward in 1941, one of history's most impressive logistical achievements, preserved that industrial capacity. The willingness to accept heavy losses, horrifying though that sounds, reflected understanding that wars are won by the side that can sustain combat longest. Germany learned these lessons too late. By the time German leaders recognized that technical superiority was insufficient, the war was already lost. German industry could not match Soviet production capacity. German logistics could not sustain operations across vast Russian distances. German manpower could not replace losses at the rate they were occurring. The Tiger, magnificent though it was in some ways, could not change these fundamental realities. 1,000 Tigers would not have been enough. 10,000 Tigers, had Germany been able to produce them, still would not have been enough, because they could not have been sustained logistically. The millions who died paid the price for these lessons. Every T-34 destroyed represented a crew, killed or wounded. Every Tiger destroyed represented more young lives ended. The battles that determined which tank was better were purchased with blood and suffering beyond imagination. We must remember these lessons, not just as military history, but as human tragedy. We must remember that the tanks we study were operated by human beings who feared, hoped, loved, and died. The statistics we analyze represent individual lives ended prematurely. We must remember it so that future generations might avoid such catastrophic waste. The Eastern Front demonstrates what happens when industrial powers commit to total war. The scale of destruction, the magnitude of suffering, the waste of human potential should serve as permanent warning. No technical superiority, no tactical brilliance, no operational advantage is worth the cost paid on the Eastern Front. The T-34 was the better tank not because it killed more efficiently, but because it ended the war sooner, ending the killing sooner. The final lesson is this: design weapons not just to win battles, but to win wars, and then to prevent wars. The T-34 won the war on the Eastern Front, not by being the best tank technically, but by being adequate technically, while excelling at everything else that mattered strategically. The Tiger lost, not because it was a bad tank in any technical sense, but because excellence in combat performance could not compensate for failure in production, logistics, and sustainability. Future weapon designers must remember this lesson. Military planners must remember this lesson. Political leaders must remember this lesson. Wars are won by systems, not by weapons. The T-34 versus Tiger comparison proves this conclusively. 70 years later, this truth remains as relevant as ever.